from Jess. If there were a snap election tomorrow, who would you vote for?
It's a very good question. I'm stuck at the moment. I feel that I'm not going to vote Conservative. I feel that Labour needs to really... Well, let me start by asking a question. How many people, stick up your hand if you know what Keir Starmer's economic policy is.
Come on, there must be someone. Keir Starmer obviously not in the audience, or maybe he is.
Stick up your hand if you think Rishi Sunak is going to win the next election.
Yes.
That's interesting. There's 5 people, 5 members of his family here in the audience. So, I mean, this is... it's such an interesting idea that Rishi Sunak is going to win the next election. But if the majority of us are right, that Rishi Sunak isn't going to win the next election, and therefore Keir Starmer is likely to be the next Prime Minister, it is slightly worrying, slightly disturbing that we don't know what his economic policy is, given that economics is at the heart of the problem that we face. So usually when I get stuck for who to vote for, I end up in a really pathetic way voting for the Lib Dems.
Rory, that is an inspiring vision of the future that your many admirers forward. So following up on that, this is from Anonymous. I know who this is. It's Gary Lineker, because he asks, so when are you and Gary Lineker going to start a political party? And there's a serious question there. I mean, to return to what I was asking at the end of the first half, you have so many ideas, you have a platform, you do have a track record as a politician. Is it enough to be a podcaster, even to run your charity? Wouldn't you want to re-engage with politics?
The honest
even
answer,
with Gary?
The honest answer, Tom, is that, as you will have found reading the book, is that I found it pretty brutal, pretty exhausting. I think that we need a new electoral system. We need proportional representation. And the reason for that is we need to create space for new parties. And if we had an electoral system where it was possible to create a new party, I think I would be very tempted to run. I ran, obviously, to try to be Mayor of London as an independent.
Okay, so there's a question from Charlotte Quamby. Are you considering running for London Mayor again?
No, and the problem is that when I ran to be mayor, the electoral system was like the French presidential system. If I could have come second to Sadiq Khan, there was a possibility of winning in the second round. But that election was cancelled for COVID, and I backed out, and they have now changed the electoral system to a first-past-the-post system. And this is at the heart of a lot of the problems. One of the reasons why these sclerotic parties keep their death grip on British politics is because we're not innovating. And look, I'm not suggesting when I talk about proportional representation that we need to go to the kind of full sort of Israeli system. We could go for New Zealand. I think New Zealand did some very good reforms in the late 90s, which have combined first past the post with a proportional system. But it allows... One of the healthy things in New Zealand, actually, we interviewed one of the New Zealand prime ministers on the podcast, is that it allows the extremes to break away. And in a sense, allowed the main left-wing and right-wing parties in New Zealand to get rid of their kind of Corbyn-Johnson fringes because people form new parties. It's good for new blood, and it's also good for refreshing the old parties.
So you described yourself in the first half and in the book as being a Tory because you respect the traditions of the country, of which I guess the traditional first past the post system, the way the Constitution has been framed would be part of it. So you're happy to publicly change your opinion on that.
That's been a big change for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I began as a huge supporter of first past the post, and it's taken me a very, very long time to acknowledge that I was wrong.
Right. So here is a question from Barbara Richardson on another British institution. How do you square your obvious support for what many see as an anachronistic monarchy with your vision for a new politics? Are you still a loyal liege man of His Majesty?
I'm very much a loyal liege man of His Majesty. I think one of the things that people often joke when I do the podcast with Alistair Campbell that we agree on everything. We don't really agree on everything at all. I am still, in some ways, a sort of weird traditional Tory, and one of the aspects of that is I really love the royal family. Now,
even Prince Andrew,
and sound a little high pitched for Prince Andrew, but maybe. No, I mean it's a very interesting. When I was in Cumbria, David Cameron would come up to my constituency, to a village, and maybe 30 or 40 people would come out in the streets to greet him. When then Prince Charles came up to Wigton, which was a town of about 4,000 people, you would have 5,000 people standing in the streets and driving horizontal Cumbrian Wain, waving little flags, and he would be stopping to shake almost every hand. He'd be doing 14 events a day. He'd be skipping his lunch. He would, and I worked with him also in Afghanistan. When we were in trouble in Afghanistan, when we were having to evacuate staff, he was writing handwritten letters to Afghans that he'd met once 10 years ago. So I have huge admiration for the monarchy. I also think we're very lucky with our current king.
Okay. So just remaining on, just for one more question on the royal theme. This is from Anonymous. Maybe it's from Megan. What is the most important thing you learned from tutoring the princes, and the most important thing you think you may have taught them?
The most important thing I learned from tutoring the princes is not to talk about tutoring the princes.
Are you not prepared to discuss what the most important thing you think you may have taught them? That's in for a dig? No, look, Rory, that Order of the Garter is looking safe. So, of course, an alternative to a monarchy is a presidency, and we've had quite a lot of questions about presidents. So here is one on the United States. Again, anonymous. How would Rory Stewart cope with the unpredictability of our principal international ally, the United States? Should we be rewriting the international order? So I imagine that is prompted by the imminent return to power of jailbird Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. One of the terrifying things is that, sadly, I mean, obviously, I want to do all I can to help people beat Donald Trump. And it's very uncomfortable talking about the fact that I'm afraid Biden does not look like somebody who's going to be president in 5 years' time. He looks frail. And I think the Democrats have missed a huge opportunity to find a new candidate. And I'm very, very worried as we get closer to the election, I guess, about two things. One of them is Biden's health, and the other is AI. I think the next election will be defined in the United States by artificial intelligence. And I think the use which AI can be put to for deep fakes, all the things that Trump was able to exploit Facebook and Twitter to do in 2016 are going to be much worse next time round. So I think Trump has a significant chance of winning this election. And it may come because of suppressing Democratic votes. It's not because of changing people's minds. Nobody's going to change their mind. It's a rerun. Everyone knows what they think about Biden and Trump. They've known what they thought about Biden and Trump for 4 years now. They're not changing their minds. But the turnout is going to be the problem. And if Trump gets in again, it is going to be devastating for what remains of the liberal world order. Devastating. And remember, this is going to be happening at a time where it is extremely likely that Marine Le Pen is going to be elected as president in France. Macron is not succeeding at the moment in generating any potential successor. And she commands the only party that seems to have the chance to come through. A Europe dominated by Marine Le Pen, by a French far-right president is much, much more worrying than anything we've seen, because the French presidency is much stronger. It's not like Giorgia Meloni, who's a populist, being elected in Italy. The Italian prime minister doesn't matter in the same way, either for Italy or for the European Union. The French president really does matter. So I think a world in which Trump takes over in the US, in which Le Pen takes over in France, in which Narendra Modi continues in India, is a very, very disturbing world.
And were that to happen, would it recalibrate your view of the hole that Britain is in? Would your perspective on British democracy perhaps slightly improve, do you think?
Yes. I think we have caught the populist bug. I think there's no accident that between 2014 and 2018 you have Modi elected in India, you have the Law and Justice Party in Poland, you have the Brexit referendum, you have Trump, you have Bolsonaro in Brazil. And that's because of some of the things we talked about in the first half. It's also about the way that social media works. I mean, Tom and I love social media, but his inhabiting of Twitter, if you follow his Twitter account, seems to largely involve rather charming comments about his love of dinosaurs or fossils, or how particularly good he is as an amazing batsman.
Politically controversial opinions.
Unfortunately, Twitter is not always like that. Twitter is not always a kind of cozy Tom Holland world. The truth of the matter is that it is, along with Facebook, has done so much to polarize and destabilize our politics. And I think what Tom's getting at with that question is that Britain, oddly, having been part of that general movement, may have come together better than some other countries. There may be some forms of resilience in Britain. We're not immune, and we shouldn't be complacent, we shouldn't be smug. I think there is a very, very bad world where Suella Braverman takes over the Conservative Party. Lee Anderson takes over the Conservative Party. Nonetheless, I think I'm reassured that for all the problems we have at the moment, we're not facing Donald Trump.
Well, it's really to push the implication of the question asked by James P. One of the arguments for the rise of populism is that deindustrialization has caused communities to feel left behind. What are your thoughts on this? But if I could just put a particular spin on that, it would be to ask, isn't there a case for saying that in giving a voice to communities that felt left behind, British democracy did actually work? There were 52% of people who did want to leave the European Union, and despite no party being in favour of it, they did get their chance to vote. And in Scotland, likewise, I know, we both were on the side of keeping Scotland in the UK in the 2014 referendum, but there was clearly a massive constituency that did want to leave the UK, and again, British democracy enabled them to have their vote. In that sense, isn't there a case for arguing that actually British democracy, relative, say, to the United States, or maybe a France run by Marine Le Pen, has actually done quite well?
The problem is that this is the way, I mean, in a sense, David Cameron perceived the Brexit referendum. He thought it was like releasing pressure. It's like a pressure valve, that you could resolve things. You give people a say, you could put the issue to bed. The problem is that what we learn with these things is that they actually intensify division. Within 2 years of that referendum, 50% of Remain voters said that they wouldn't be prepared to speak to a Brexit voter, and vice versa. And
but do you think that's improved, or has it got worse?
Well, I mean, I think one thing's definitely improved. I mean, the same poll suggested 25% of Brexit voters only would allow their child to marry a Remain voter. I think things have improved. I think we've come through that a bit. But I still think that we missed an enormous opportunity to take a 52-48 vote, which was close, and therefore do a soft compromise Brexit. I think the thing that will be mysterious in the future is how British politics failed there. Why did we not come out of that and say this was a close vote, we're going to go with a customs union, or we're going to go with a single market? Why did we say that what we're going to do is we're going to come out and say half the population is going to reject the result of the referendum entirely and ask for a second referendum or to stay in the EU, and the other half is going to try to push for a much, much harder Brexit. What happened to the idea of politics as compromise?
Yeah. And of course, if you have proportional representation, then politics becomes all about compromise, I guess. Yeah. So we've got a lot of questions on specifics of political policy. So Anonymous, I'm guessing this is from Rishi Sunak. With your vast international experience, how would you tackle the small boats crisis?
Okay, well, let me try to be controversial here and alienate people in the audience, which is always a fun thing to do just before you all go home. I believe that France is a safe country. I also believe that there are many tens of millions of people in the world in terrible, terrible need of asylum, at threat. Female judges in Afghanistan. Many, many people in Somalia and Sudan and the Central African Republic. And we have a moral obligation towards those people. I think it does not make moral or practical sense to encourage people to leave France on rickety rafts heading for the United Kingdom.
Nobody is encouraging them apart from the people traffickers, are they?
I'm afraid there are people, I have friends, who essentially think that this is a good thing and that trying to stop it happening is a bad thing. And I believe the reverse. I believe we should be trying to stop it happening. I believe we should be doing a deal with France where we say we will take 20,000, 30,000 asylum seekers from France on a needs basis, depending on the type of problems they face. So those are people coming from Afghanistan or Somalia who've arrived in France and claimed asylum. We will take the burden of that, and in return, we will return back to France anybody who gets on a boat to the United Kingdom.
And do you think that that's a deal that the French government would be open to?
Yes, because it's effectively taking a lot of the strain off them of something that's very politically complex and difficult for them, which is their own asylum policy. And it's essentially what we have had to do with Turkey. It's what we'll have to do with North Africa. You cannot have a system that favors and prioritizes predominantly young men risking their lives in small boats crossing from a safe country like France to a safe country like England. That is not a sensible asylum policy.
But do you think there's any possibility that not just a Tory government, but a British government would sign up to that deal?
Yes, and I think the way that you do it is you make an international coalition about this. So what I would like Keir Starmer to do is to say that every country in the world commits to take, every developed country, a certain percentage of their population in asylum every year. Britain would take, let's say, 25,000, 30,000 people a year. The United States would take 125,000 a year. Canada would take 15,000 a year, etc.
Japan?
It would be a big international. Japan is very, very reluctant to do this. You're right. It's good to raise Japan. But I think you would set a target.
China?
And you would aim just to develop this, right? That would equate to the average town of, let's say, 10,000 people in Britain agreeing to take a family of 5 once a year. That's very, very manageable. We can communicate that to the population, and that is much better than small boats crossing the channel.
Okay, you've solved that. Let's move on to another pressing issue. This is from Kate. What should we do about the housing crisis? This has been turbocharged by recent changes in the planning law to do with the amount of gunk that can flow into rivers. That's a politically neutral take on.
Firstly, I think start with the fact we have a housing crisis, and it is extremely difficult for people to afford their rent, and it's almost impossible for people to buy. So if we're looking at London, I would start, if I was the mayor of London, with building social housing. I would aim to build 250,000 social houses in London, and you would be building it on nearly 10,000 acres of Transport for London land Mayor of London land. You could do it in a very smart way. You could borrow the money. You could locate it where you know your future infrastructure investments are going. You could build high-quality houses, and you could recoup that money through the rent that you charged. So we should be doing that. We should be doing that in London. We should be doing that around the country. I also think that we should be much, much more open towards building medium rise. Not tower blocks, but 6, 7-story buildings. In fact, some of the fanciest areas in London, Sloane Avenue, for example, is 7, 8-story buildings. France, Paris, is 6, 7-story buildings. A lot of those beautiful boulevards that you see. One of the problems with Britain is that we are allergic to going up. If we are to solve the housing crisis, we need to work out how to go up. And that doesn't need to feel brutal and unattractive. Many of the most beautiful cities in the world have people living good lives in buildings which are 6 stories high, and we should start doing that much more.
And do you think that it's possible to solve the housing crisis while, for instance, also ensuring the survival of a mammal that I know is close to both our hearts, the hedgehog? What's the balance between ensuring that people have houses and ensuring that we don't wipe out
I thought he was going to
much-loved wildlife?
I thought he was going to go with the newt. He went with the hedgehog.
But Rory, your most YouTubed video was on hedgehogs, and I know because I watched it.
It's one of the signs the deep seriousness of British politics. That the one speech I gave in Parliament that was watched more than anything else was a 12-minute speech on hedgehogs.
Because Rory, actually, I mean, to be serious, because that's part of that. That's what matters. Politicians should engage with those kind of issues, I think, because they matter to people. They certainly matter to me. So, do you think that it's possible to square the demands of the environment and the demands of people for?
I think one of the things that politicians like to pretend is that you can have it all. And of course, the truth is that growth of any sort is very difficult for the environment. We live in a world of finite resources. You can't have infinite growth. It's not possible to put another 3.5 million houses into Britain without building over green fields and having an impact on nature. And it's also true that we have to find a way of doing much better, much bolder environmental and climate policy and energy transition, getting people off petrol, off coal, off gas, without pushing the burden of that cost onto the very poorest people in our country. One of the problems at the moment is we're doing it through taxing energy use, and energy use is a much higher proportion of the budgets of the poor than it is of the wealthy. We have to change behavior, but we shouldn't do it in that way. We should find a way of doing it that is not regressive, and the way that I would suggest is that we should be giving, for example, with the ULEZ, we should be giving cash grants to people. Yes, you must transition, but the government should be providing for people on low incomes the cash grants to allow them to transition, and the burden of that should come from wealth taxes on the wealthy.
Okay.